Pack your bags. You're coming with me, Hunter said after finding young servant twins eating scraps. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun had barely risen, and the small, dilapidated shack where the young twins had been left was already sweltering under the oppressive heat of the desert. The once proud adobe walls, now cracked and crumbling, did little to protect them from the scorching rays of the early morning sun. Inside, two young children sat hunched together on the dirt floor, their gaunt faces dirty and their clothes torn. They were no older than 6 or 7, but the hardship they had faced had already aged them far beyond their years. Their stomachs growled, empty and aching. They stared at the scraps of stale bread and dried meat, remnants from a meager meal, unsure whether it was worth the effort to eat or just more painful than it was worth. The twins had been abandoned by their parents, left to fend for themselves in a world that had shown them little kindness. Their father, a struggling farmer, had lost everything to debt, and their mother, too weary to care for them any longer, had simply walked away. Now, the children were alone in a barren wasteland, forced to rely on their wits and whatever scraps they could scrounge up. Their hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, but so was the fear that their fate would soon be sealed if they couldn't escape. They knew the stories. They had heard whispers from other children about the men who roamed the desert, men who took those who were left behind and sold them into slavery or worse. The door to the shack creaked open, a gust of hot desert air rushing inside. The twins froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. But it wasn't a gang of outlaws or a cruel traitor who stood in the doorway. It was a man, a stranger dressed in worn leather, his broad shoulders framed by the doorframe. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the room before landing on the twins. His expression softened, though his face remained grim. "You too," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "You're coming with me." The twins stared at him in shock, their bodies tense, unsure of what to do. The man, noticing their hesitation, stepped inside, his boots kicking up the dust as he crouched down to their level. "Don't worry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I won't hurt you. I'm here to help." The older twin, a girl with big brown eyes and matted hair, looked at her brother, unsure whether to trust the stranger. Her brother, smaller and quieter, clung to her side, his face pale with fear. The man let out a sigh and extended a hand. "I'm not here to take you away like those men in the stories," he said, his voice gentle but resolute. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere you don't have to worry about being abandoned again." The twins exchanged a glance, uncertainty in their eyes. But there was something about this man, something that made them believe his words, even if only for a moment. The girl hesitated, then slowly reached out to take his hand. It was rough and calloused, but it was warm, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. The man pulled them to their feet, his grip firm but not unkind. "Pack your bags," he said, his voice steady. "You're coming with me." The twins followed him out of the shack, their small footsteps leaving imprints in the dirt as they walked toward the unknown. But with each step, they felt a sense of safety that had long been missing from their lives. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they would no longer be left to starve in the desert, where they would find someone who would protect them, no matter the cost. "I know you were scared, but I promise you, you will be all right." The man's words echoed in the twins' minds as they walked through the desert, their feet heavy with exhaustion. The dry, cracked earth beneath them seemed endless, stretching far beyond what they could see. The sun beat down mercilessly, its rays piercing their skin, but despite the harsh conditions, they felt a strange comfort in the presence of the man who had rescued them. He had led them away from the shack, away from the suffocating heat, and into the unknown. His silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say much to reassure them, and somehow that made them feel safer. He had been kind, gentle even, despite the roughness of his appearance. His weathered leather jacket and cowboy hat gave him an air of mystery, but there was a quiet strength in the way he moved, and it made the twins believe in the promise he had made. As the sun climbed higher, they walked without speaking, the sound of their footsteps in the dust the only noise between them. The twins exchanged occasional glances, but said nothing. They were used to being silent, used to being ignored or treated as invisible. For so long, they had been cast aside, as if their existence didn't matter. But this man, this stranger, was different. His presence was a stark contrast to the life they had known. The longer they walked, the more their fear began to dissipate, replaced by something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had never dared to imagine that someone would care enough to protect them, but this man was doing just that. The girl, whose name was Emma, walked beside her brother, James, her hand lightly gripping his. They had been through so much together, and their bond was unbreakable. They had always looked out for each other, and now, with the stranger beside them, it felt as if they might finally be free of the fear that had haunted them for so long. After hours of walking, the man finally spoke. "We'll stop soon. There's a creek up ahead. You both need to drink something and rest." Emma nodded silently, her throat dry and cracked from the relentless heat. Her mind wandered back to the days before, to the hunger and the loneliness they had felt. They had barely survived in that shack, scraping by on whatever scraps they could find. There were days when they had nothing to eat at all, and the nights were spent shivering in the cold. They had learned to stay quiet, to be invisible, because no one had ever cared about their suffering. But now, with this man, they were no longer invisible. They were no longer alone. The man guided them toward a small patch of trees, where the sound of running water reached their ears. He motioned for them to sit by the creek, and they eagerly lowered themselves to the cool earth, the sound of the water flowing soothing their tired bodies. "Drink," the man instructed, his voice soft but firm. Emma hesitated for a moment before cupping her hands and drinking the cool water. It tasted like freedom, like something she hadn't realized she had been missing for so long. James followed suit, his small hands trembling as he brought the water to his lips. For a few moments, they sat in silence, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over them. It was a strange feeling, but one they hadn't known in years. The man sat nearby, watching over them as they drank. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the area around them, but there was a warmth in his gaze whenever he looked back at the twins. He had seen hardship in his life, and he understood the weight of what they had been through. After they had drunk their fill, the man stood and stretched. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll make our way to a safe place. It's a long journey, but I'll get you both there. I swear it." Emma looked up at him, her face still weary but filled with a glimmer of hope. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice soft and unsure. The man paused, his expression hardening slightly. "Somewhere better," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Somewhere you don't have to be afraid anymore. Somewhere you can be free." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated deeply within Emma. For the first time, she believed that there might be a place where she and James could finally find peace. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the man made a fire, and the twins sat close to the warmth. They ate what little food he had, some dried meat and bread, and though it was meager, it was enough. They were no longer alone in the world. And as the night grew colder, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The hope that, maybe, just maybe, they had found a new beginning. "I know you're both scared, but we're going to make it. I'll take care of you." The man's voice, calm and steady, became a reassuring presence as Emma and James followed him through the wilderness. It had been 2 days since the rescue, and they had traveled further than either of them had ever imagined, leaving the desolate shack and their painful past far behind. The land around them was harsh, but it felt different now. They were no longer alone. The man had kept his word. He had provided food and shelter, and, most importantly, he had given them hope. The heat of the midday sun beat down on them, but it no longer felt unbearable. The man, whose name was Ethan, led them through narrow paths between the rough, jagged rocks. His pace was steady, as though the weight of the world didn't rest on his shoulders. But Emma and James could feel it, the sense of responsibility he carried for them. He never showed it, but it was there, in the way he looked out for them, scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes, always alert, always watching. As they walked, Emma felt a strange sense of calm come over her. She had never been on a journey like this before, not like this. She had always been afraid, always wondering if anyone would come to help them, and now, somehow, she felt that everything might turn out all right. Ethan had promised to protect them, and she was beginning to believe that promise. The air grew cooler as they reached a small creek. The water was clear, winding its way through the trees, and Ethan motioned for them to stop. "Rest here," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll set up camp." Emma and James sat by the water, and Ethan quickly went to work gathering firewood. He moved with purpose, his hands rough but capable, creating a small fire in no time. The twins watched him in silence, still adjusting to the quiet safety that now surrounded them. It was a stark contrast to the fear and hunger they had felt only days before. As Ethan worked, Emma felt the weight of their journey sink in. They weren't just running away from the shack anymore. They were moving towards something. A future, perhaps, something they had never dared to imagine. But what would that future look like? She didn't know, and part of her still felt unsure about trusting a stranger, even one who had saved their lives. But when she looked at James, who was sitting quietly beside her, she realized they had no choice but to trust Ethan. She didn't want to be alone again, and neither did James. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Ethan returned with some small game he had caught along the way. "It's not much," he said, as he began preparing the meat over the fire, "but it'll do for tonight." The twins watched him work, their stomachs growling in anticipation. They hadn't eaten much since the scraps they had found in the shack, and the smell of roasting meat made their mouths water. As they ate, the warmth of the fire, the food, and the sense of security wrapped around them like a blanket. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt full. She felt safe. Ethan watched them eat, his gaze softening slightly. "You too," he said quietly. "You're stronger than you know." Emma met his eyes for a moment, then looked down at her hands, the scars of their past still fresh but fading. "We never had a choice," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. "No, you didn't," he said. "But you're not alone now, and that changes everything." The words lingered in the air between them, and for a moment, Emma allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. That night, as they settled into their makeshift camp, the stars shining brightly above them, Ethan spoke again. "Tomorrow, we move on," he said, looking into the distance, where the shadows of the mountains loomed. "There's a place I know, a place where you two can be safe. But we have to keep moving." Emma nodded, understanding the unspoken warning in his words. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. They would keep moving, and maybe, just maybe, they would find the safety they had been searching for all along. As the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, Emma closed her eyes, holding on to the warmth of the moment, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Together, they would survive. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I can't leave you both out here, not like this." Ethan's voice broke the quiet of the night. As he stared into the fire, the flickering light reflecting in his eyes. Emma and James sat close to him, the warmth of the flames bringing a sense of calm, but his words hung heavy in the air. The twins had gotten used to the rhythm of their journey, walking by day, resting by night, and staying silent as they moved through the wilderness. But tonight, something felt different. Ethan's resolve was stronger than ever. "We'll be stopping soon," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "There's a settlement up ahead, a safe place for both of you. But it won't be easy getting there." Emma and James exchanged a look. They had heard whispers of settlements, places where people lived together in peace, but they never truly believed in them. The world they had known was harsh, filled with abandonment, hunger, and fear. But the promise of safety, even if distant and uncertain, made their hearts quicken with hope. Ethan leaned forward, his hands still, as he added, "You don't have to worry about a thing. I'll get you there, no matter what." The air felt still around them as they sat in silence, only the sound of the fire crackling breaking the quiet. The stars above were clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the shadows of their lives. Emma felt a sense of unease, though she wasn't sure why. The journey had been long, but Ethan had kept them safe. Yet, there was something in his eyes tonight, something that told her he wasn't as certain about the future as he tried to seem. "What kind of place is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up at her, his expression soft but guarded. "It's a place where you can rest, he said slowly. No more running. No more worrying about where the next meal will come from. But it won't be like the world you knew. It's different. The uncertainty in his tone caught Emma off guard. She looked at James, whose face was still pale but now seemed a little more hopeful. Why is it different? She asked, pressing him further. Ethan stood, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the firelight. He didn't immediately answer, instead walking to the edge of the camp, staring into the distance. It's a place where you can be free, he said finally, his voice low. But freedom comes with its own cost. It's not a place for everyone. Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't want to think about what that might mean. She only wanted to believe in the possibility of safety. What kind of cost? She asked quietly, not wanting to know the answer, but needing to hear it. Ethan turned back to face them, his eyes tired but resolute. You'll understand when you get there, he said, his tone final. But for now, let's focus on getting you both there first. Emma nodded, unsure of what to think. She wanted to trust Ethan, but the unknowns gnawed at her. James, sensing her unease, took her hand in his small fingers gripping hers tightly. She squeezed his hand in return, feeling the strength in the bond they shared. They had been through so much together, and no matter what happened next, they would face it side by side. We'll stick together, she whispered to him, her voice firm. Ethan watched them for a moment before nodding. We'll leave at first light, he said, his voice softer now. Get some rest. You'll need your strength for tomorrow. As the night deepened, the twins settled into their blankets, their bodies weary but their minds still restless. Ethan remained by the fire, the glow from the flames casting deep shadows on his face. Emma tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept racing. What kind of place was this settlement? And what did Ethan mean by the cost of freedom? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something bigger than any of them could understand. The uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to push the thoughts away. She would rest now, and tomorrow, they would continue. She would trust Ethan, for now, and believe in the possibility of a better life. But deep down, a small part of her wondered what was waiting for them at the end of their journey. Would they truly be safe, or was this just another trap? Only time would tell. As the fire burned low and the night grew still, Emma closed her eyes, holding onto the hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found the beginning of something better. A place where they could finally stop running. I know you both have a lot of questions. I don't have all the answers, but I'll get you to safety. Ethan's voice was calm, but the weight of the journey ahead hung heavily in the air. Emma and James followed closely behind him, their feet dragging from exhaustion. But there was something different in the way they moved now. There was no fear in their steps, just the quiet, steady rhythm of walking forward into an uncertain future. The sun had barely begun to rise when Ethan led them through the dense forest, his gaze constantly sweeping the landscape, scanning for any signs of trouble. The air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the day before. They had rested long enough, and now it was time to keep moving. The settlement Ethan had promised them was still a few days away, and every step they took was another step closer to that unknown place. Emma walked silently beside James, her hand gripping his tightly, but there was something else in her, an uncertainty that she couldn't quite shake off. Ethan had been kind, but there was always a sense of distance, a guardedness in his demeanor that made Emma wonder if there was more to his story than he let on. She wanted to trust him, but after everything they had been through, she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of caution. They passed through the thick woods in silence, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the forest floor. The occasional bird call echoed through the trees, and the wind rustled the leaves above them. Despite the beauty around them, Emma's mind was consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. What would this settlement be like? Would it be as safe as Ethan promised, or was it just another place to run from? As they walked, the forest began to thin out, and soon they were on a narrow path that wound its way through a valley. The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the land, and Emma could feel the temperature rising with it. Ethan led them down the path, his pace steady and unhurried, but there was a certain tension in his movements. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the valley that Emma understood why. Ahead of them, the landscape opened up to reveal a sprawling camp nestled between two high hills. The camp was quiet, the tents and makeshift structures blending into the natural surroundings. But there was something about the place that felt off, something that made Emma's stomach twist in knots. Ethan stopped at the edge of the valley, his eyes scanning the camp. "This is where we stop for now," he said, his voice low and cautious. Emma felt her heart race as she looked at the camp, her mind racing with questions. Why had Ethan brought them here? Was this the settlement he had promised, or was this something else entirely? "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "It's a safe place," he said. "But not everyone here will be as welcoming as you'd like." Emma's stomach churned with unease. She had heard stories about places like this, hidden camps, run by people who had their own rules and their own agendas. Was this one of those places? "Are you saying we can't stay here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on the camp. "No, we'll stay for the night," he said, his tone firm but not reassuring. "But be careful. There are people here who might not like strangers." The uncertainty in his voice only made Emma's unease grow. She looked over at James, who had been unusually quiet, his eyes wide with uncertainty. They had come so far, but now, Emma wasn't sure what to think. Ethan had saved them, but was this the safety he had promised? They made their way into the camp, Ethan leading them through the narrow path that cut between the tents. The people who lived here watched them as they passed, their eyes filled with suspicion. Some were sitting by the fire, while others worked around the camp, tending to their animals or repairing equipment. The atmosphere felt tense, charged with an underlying current of distrust. As they reached a small clearing, Ethan stopped and turned to them. "Stay close," he said quietly, "and don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to trust Ethan, but the feeling in her gut told her that there was more going on here than he was letting on. The camp was everything she had feared, full of secrets, full of people who lived by their own rules. Ethan set up their small camp in the clearing, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, alert for any signs of danger. The twins huddled together, trying to ignore the stares of the people around them. As night fell, the camp grew quieter, the sounds of the forest replaced by the crackling of the fire. Ethan sat beside them, his face illuminated by the flames. "Tomorrow, we'll move on," he said, his voice low. "But for tonight, we stay here. Rest up, because we'll need our strength for what's to come." Emma didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. There was something about this camp, something about Ethan's warning, that told her this was just another stop on a journey that would lead them into even more danger. But she had no choice but to follow. For now, she would trust him. For now, she would trust that they were safe, at least for the night. "I told you to stay close." Ethan's voice cut through the night, low and urgent, as the fire crackled softly beside their small camp. Emma and James were sitting by the fire, trying to keep warm as the cool mountain air settled in around them. The shadows from the fire stretched long over the ground, but something felt wrong. It was a feeling Emma couldn't shake, a sense that they were no longer alone. The quiet in the camp was unsettling. After everything they had been through, after the long days of walking and the fear of being hunted, the silence now felt like a trap. The sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, reached Emma's ears. She held her breath, eyes darting around the camp. The fire's glow barely illuminated the edges of the trees, casting everything just out of reach of the light. Ethan's gaze flicked around the perimeter, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife at his belt. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." Emma nodded, her heart racing in her chest. James squeezed her hand, his small fingers trembling. She pulled him closer, feeling the weight of their situation press down on her. What was going on? Was it just her imagination, or was someone really out there? The footsteps grew louder, and Emma's stomach tightened with dread. The air seemed to grow heavier, the night colder. The crackle of the fire was the only sound that broke the stillness. Ethan stood, silent and unmoving, as he scanned the darkness. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, a figure stepped from the shadows, emerging into the weak light of the fire. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the hood of his cloak. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the camp as if he had been expecting someone. Ethan's hand never left his knife, but he didn't move toward the stranger. Instead, he stood his ground, his stance solid and unyielding. The man stopped just at the edge of the firelight, his voice gravelly and low. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm just passing through, looking for shelter for the night." Emma felt a rush of relief, but it was quickly replaced with suspicion. Why hadn't Ethan warned them about strangers in this camp? Why did he seem so cautious? The man stepped forward a little more, eyes narrowing as he took in the small camp. "I've heard rumors," he said, his voice quieter now, "that a couple of kids were seen in this area. Thought I might find them here." Emma's heart skipped a beat. How did he know about them? Ethan's grip on his knife tightened, and he took a step toward the man, his eyes cold. "What do you want with them?" he asked, his voice firm and unyielding. The stranger raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of something darker beneath. "I heard about the two kids, thought I might be able to help. If they're here." Emma glanced at Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was this man? What did he know about them? She hadn't heard anything about anyone looking for them, and yet this stranger seemed to know more than he should. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're not taking them anywhere." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a short laugh, almost as if he were amused. "I'm not here to take them," he said, his tone lightening. "Just here to offer help." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his stance unyielding. "Help?" he repeated, skeptical. "From who?" The man's gaze flicked to the twins, then back to Ethan. "From someone who doesn't want to see them get hurt," he said softly. "Someone who can offer them protection." A chill ran down Emma's spine as she caught the look in the man's eyes. There was something unsettling about him, something that didn't quite sit right. Ethan wasn't convinced, and neither was Emma. She could feel the weight of the stranger's words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "What kind of protection?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile faltered for a moment, before he looked at them both with a strange glimmer of something in his eyes. "Protection from the people hunting them," he said. "People who know they're here." Emma froze. Someone was hunting them. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It had never occurred to her that their journey to safety could have a darker side, that they might be pursued, that they weren't as free as they had hoped. Ethan's eyes flicked to the twins, his face hardening. "We'll take our chances without your help," he said firmly. "Now, you need to leave." The man didn't seem surprised by Ethan's refusal. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he had expected this response. "I'll be around," he said, his voice carrying a quiet finality. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving the camp eerily quiet once more. Ethan remained standing, watching the spot where the man had disappeared, his posture tense. Emma could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Who had that man been? And why had he come looking for them? The fire crackled softly, but the silence that followed felt far too loud. Ethan turned to the twins, his expression unreadable. "Go to sleep," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We leave at first light." Emma and James lay down, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, but their minds were far from peaceful. What was coming for them, and why was it following them here? The questions lingered in the night air, unanswered, as they drifted into uneasy sleep. "I told you to stay close." Ethan's voice was firm, but there was a slight tremor in his words. Emma and James followed closely behind, their small legs carrying them as quickly as they could, but the weight of the previous night's encounter hung heavily in the air. The stranger's words had settled in Emma's mind like stones in her stomach. They weren't just running away anymore. They were being hunted. She couldn't stop thinking about it, even as they moved forward, stepping carefully over the rough terrain. Ethan led them through the dense forest, the path barely visible through the thick underbrush. Every so often, he would stop and scan the area around them, his sharp eyes sweeping the forest. Emma noticed that his movements were more cautious now, more deliberate. The confidence he had shown before seemed to have faded, replaced by something harder, something that Emma couldn't quite place. She glanced over at James, who was walking silently beside her, his face pale with exhaustion. She could feel the weight of his worry, just as she felt her own. They hadn't spoken much since the stranger had left, but the silence between them was deafening. Ethan finally stopped, holding up a hand to signal for them to be still. Emma's heart raced as she followed his gaze to a clearing up ahead. There, in the center of the clearing, was a figure. A man. The same man they had encountered last night. He stood motionless, as though waiting for them, and Emma's pulse quickened. Ethan's face hardened, and his eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. "Stay behind me," he said softly, his voice low. Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The stranger had already made it clear he wasn't just passing through. He had been looking for them, waiting for them. Ethan moved forward cautiously, his hand resting on the handle of his knife, ready for whatever might come next. The man, noticing Ethan's approach, finally spoke, his voice calm and collected. "I wasn't lying," he said. "I'm here to help." Ethan stopped a few paces from him, his body tense. "Help?" Ethan's voice was sharp, skeptical. "You're following us. How is that helping?" The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his expression unchanging. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "But you're not safe. You don't know what's coming for you." Ethan's eyes flicked to Emma and James, his face unreadable. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Who's coming for us?" The man hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice lowering to a whisper. "There are people who know you're here. They know about the children, and they'll stop at nothing to get them." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at James, who was clutching her hand, his eyes wide with fear. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would anyone want us?" The man's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, lowering his hands. "It's not about you," he said. "It's about the ones who are looking for you. The ones who want to use you to get what they want." Ethan took a step forward, his voice firm. "And what is it you want from us?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Nothing," he said. "But I know what's coming for you, and I can help you escape it. If you'll let me." Ethan's eyes flicked over to Emma and James, and for a moment, there was a hesitation in his posture. Emma could see it, the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't trust the man, but the words he spoke made sense. They had been running, but for what? Was there more to this than just finding safety? Was someone really chasing them? She didn't know, but her instincts told her that the stranger wasn't lying. "We don't need your help," Ethan said, his voice hardening again. "We've made it this far on our own." The man's smile faded slightly, and he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, his voice softening. "But I'm warning you. There's nowhere you can run. They will find you, and when they do, it won't end well for you. Or the kids." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He turned to Emma and James, who were standing a few feet away, their faces filled with fear and confusion. "You need to decide," the man said. "You can run, but it won't be enough. Or you can trust me, and I can get you to safety." Ethan stood silent for a moment, his face a mask of indecision. Emma could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. She looked at James, whose eyes were filled with uncertainty. She could feel his fear, just as she felt her own. But there was something about the man's words, the urgency in his voice, that made her hesitate. They had been running for so long, but now, for the first time, they had a chance, maybe their only chance, to find real safety. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "All right," he said, turning back to the man. "We'll follow you. But if you try anything, there will be consequences." The man nodded, his face serious. "I understand. Follow me, and I'll get you to safety." As they followed the stranger through the dense forest, Emma's mind was racing. What had they gotten themselves into? What was really out there, waiting for them? And what would happen if they trusted this man? She didn't know the answers, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. They might just make it out of this alive. But the path ahead was uncertain, and there were more dangers lurking in the shadows than they could imagine. "I told you we need to stay quiet." Ethan's voice was low, but his words cut through the tension in the air like a knife. The dense forest around them was eerily silent as they followed the stranger deeper into the woods. Emma's heart raced as she walked behind Ethan, her hand gripping her brother James tightly. The chill of the morning air clung to her skin, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the uneasy feeling that had been growing in her chest ever since they had made the decision to trust the stranger. She didn't know why she felt so uncertain. He hadn't done anything to hurt them, and yet something about him felt off. She glanced up at Ethan, his face set with determination as he led them forward, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. He had been unusually quiet since they agreed to follow the stranger, but Emma could tell he was just as wary as she was. After everything they had been through, after all the times they had been lied to or abandoned, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was another trap waiting to happen. "Why are we trusting him?" Emma finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do we know he won't turn on us?" Ethan didn't answer at first, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the path ahead. It was like he was thinking deeply, considering the same questions that Emma was asking herself. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice tight. "I don't trust him completely. But right now, we don't have any other choice. If we keep running on our own, we're just going to keep running. We need a place to rest, a place where we can finally catch our breath." Emma nodded, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. She wanted to believe that this was the right choice, that the stranger was just a man trying to help, but doubt still gnawed at her. They had been in worse situations before, and each time, it had seemed like a new opportunity to find safety, only to have it ripped away in an instant. She glanced back over her shoulder, but the forest behind them was quiet, nothing but trees and shadows. No one was following them. Not yet. The stranger, who had introduced himself as Jonah, led them deeper into the woods, stopping occasionally to check the path. His movements were smooth and practiced, as if he had spent years traveling through these woods. Despite the calm exterior, Emma could see that he was just as alert as Ethan, constantly scanning their surroundings. "We're almost there," Jonah said after a while, his voice calm but carrying a hint of urgency. "We'll stop in a safe place for now. You'll be able to rest, get some food, and figure out what you want to do next." Emma's mind raced as she processed his words. "What do you mean, figure out what you want to do next?" she asked, her voice shaking with uncertainty. Jonah glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay here forever, but you need to think carefully about your next move. The people after you, they won't stop, and they're getting closer." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He stopped walking and turned to face them, his eyes locking onto Emma's. "Because I've been running from them too," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to be hunted. I know what it's like to run, to never be able to rest, always looking over your shoulder." Ethan's eyes flicked between Emma and Jonah, his expression hardening. "So, you want us to trust you because you've been in the same situation?" Jonah didn't flinch at Ethan's suspicion. "I'm not asking for trust," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking for a chance. You have nowhere else to go, and I can get you somewhere safe. But you have to decide if you're willing to take that risk." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the sincerity in Jonah's eyes, but she still didn't know if she could trust him. After everything they had been through, after so many false promises and betrayals, it was hard to believe that this time would be different. But something in his voice, the way he spoke about being hunted, made her hesitate. He wasn't just some stranger offering empty words. He knew what it was like to be desperate, to be on the run, to fear for your life. For the first time, Emma felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. They had been running for so long, and every step had felt like they were just getting further from safety. But maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. Maybe Jonah could lead them to a place where they could finally stop running. She glanced at James, who had been eerily quiet the entire time. His small face was pale, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. He was looking to her, waiting for her decision. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "All right," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "We'll trust you. But if you're lying..." Jonah held up his hand, cutting her off. "I'm not lying. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Emma nodded, her heart still heavy but a little lighter than before. She didn't know if this was the right choice, but she knew that it was the only choice they had left. With one last glance at Ethan, who gave a reluctant nod of approval, they followed Jonah deeper into the woods. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way out of the endless chase. The journey wasn't over, but it had changed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to believe that they might finally be safe. "I told you this wasn't going to be easy." Jonah's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. Emma and James had been following him through the dense woods for hours, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth beneath them. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the path was narrow, winding through the trees with no clear direction. Despite the beauty of the landscape, Emma couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. They had been moving deeper into the wilderness for what felt like days, and the further they went, the more the silence around them grew. There was no sign of life, no birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan walked a few paces ahead, his posture stiff, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees. Emma could tell that he was just as uneasy as she was, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something harder. The closer they got to wherever Jonah was leading them, the more the tension in the air thickened. It wasn't just the quiet that made Emma nervous. It was the feeling that they were being watched, that something, or someone, was lurking just beyond their vision. How much further? Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jonah glanced over his shoulder, his face unreadable. Not far, he replied, his voice low. We're almost there. But keep your guard up. This is the part where it gets dangerous. Emma's heart skipped a beat at his words. Dangerous? She had heard the word too many times, each time accompanied by a sense of impending doom. But she didn't question Jonah. They had trusted him so far, and there was no turning back now. Still, her grip on James' hand tightened. The younger boy, walking beside her, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, though her own heart was pounding. Jonah led them to the top of a small ridge, where the trees parted, revealing a narrow valley below. At the far end of the valley, Emma saw what Jonah had been leading them toward. A settlement. It was small, barely more than a few tents and makeshift buildings. But there were people there. People who had been living off the grid, away from the world they had known. Emma couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the place they had been searching for. Maybe here, they could finally rest. But as they moved closer, Emma saw the expressions of the people in the settlement. They were watching them carefully, some with open suspicion, others with curiosity. There was no warmth in their eyes, only a quiet wariness, like they had seen too much, lost too much, to trust easily. Jonah moved ahead, his pace steady, but his eyes never left the faces around them. He raised his hand slightly, signaling for Emma and James to follow closely. As they approached one of the tents, a tall man stepped forward. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating. Jonah stopped in front of him, and the two exchanged a look that made Emma's stomach tighten. These are the kids, Jonah said, his voice firm. The man nodded once, then turned his gaze to Emma and James. I see, he said, his voice gruff. You brought them here. Do you know what that means? Jonah didn't respond immediately. He stood tall, his eyes meeting the man's with a quiet challenge. They're safe here, Jonah said finally. For now. The man didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning Emma and James, then flicked his gaze back to Jonah. They won't be safe for long, he said bluntly. The ones after them won't stop. You know that, don't you? Emma's heart sank at his words. They weren't safe. Not here either. The danger had followed them. She felt a chill creep up her spine, her breath catching in her throat. They've been running for too long, Jonah said, his voice low and steady. We can't stay on the move forever. They need protection, and this place is as good as any. The tall man seemed to consider Jonah's words for a moment before nodding curtly. I'll let them stay, but they'll have to prove themselves. This isn't a place for weak hearts. Jonah gave a small nod, acknowledging the man's terms. Understood. Emma felt her chest tighten. She had no idea what kind of test they would have to face, but she knew that if they wanted to stay here, they would have to prove themselves worthy. The man turned away, signaling for them to follow. Come on, he said, his voice gruff. I'll show you where you'll sleep. But don't get too comfortable. You won't be here long if you don't pull your weight. Emma followed, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The settlement wasn't the safety she had imagined. It was a place just like the world they had left behind, full of mistrust and suspicion, where survival was the only rule that mattered. As they settled into a small corner of the camp, Emma glanced around at the people who lived here. Some were sharpening knives, others were tending to fires, and a few children played nearby, their eyes flicking nervously between the strangers and their parents. It was a world of quiet tension, where even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. Ethan sat beside Emma and James, his face hard with thought. He was still on edge, still unsure about the place they had found. Emma could feel his unease, but she didn't know what to say to ease it. She didn't know how to make sense of any of this. Jonah had led them here, but now, they were just another group of strangers, trying to survive in a place that had no room for weakness. Emma could feel the weight of it all, the endless running, the fear, the uncertainty. But as she looked at James, who was curled up beside her, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And that, she thought, was the only hope they had left. I told you to stay sharp. Jonah's words hung in the air as the camp settled into uneasy silence. Emma and James sat close together, watching the flickering fire as it cast long shadows across the settlement. The people around them moved with a quiet purpose, some exchanging words in hushed tones, others keeping to themselves. It was a place of hard survival, where trust was earned, not given. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her thoughts racing. The promise of safety they had been chasing seemed more like a distant dream now. The settlement was nothing like she had imagined. It was no sanctuary, just another place where survival was the only rule that mattered. The man who had greeted them earlier, the one who had made it clear they weren't entirely welcome, passed by them again, giving them a sharp look before moving on to whatever task was at hand. Emma felt the weight of his gaze, the suspicion in his eyes, and it made her stomach churn. She could feel the tension in the air, how everything here was held together by a thin thread. One wrong move, one misstep, and it would all unravel. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice low as he crouched next to her. Emma nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. "I don't know," she whispered, glancing at James. "This place, it's not what I thought it would be." Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes hardening as he surveyed the camp. "Yeah, it's not. But we don't have much of a choice. At least for now." His words carried a heaviness that Emma couldn't ignore. She had known, of course, that they couldn't keep running forever. But this place, she wasn't so sure it was any better than what they had left behind. The air was thick with an underlying fear, the kind that gnawed at you even when no one was watching. The man, who had been acting as their guide through the settlement, came over to them again. His face was hard, his eyes unreadable. "I hope you two understand the stakes here," he said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't a place for outsiders who can't pull their weight. You want to stay? You'll need to contribute. You'll need to prove yourselves." Ethan stood, his posture tense as he faced the man. "We're just trying to survive," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We'll contribute. Just show us what needs to be done." The man didn't respond right away. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally gave a curt nod. "Fine," he said. "But remember, you're here on my terms. Help is given, but it's earned. You're on borrowed time here. Make it count." With that, he turned and walked off, leaving Emma and Ethan standing there, their minds racing. Emma looked up at Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean?" "Borrowed time." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It means if we don't prove ourselves soon, they'll toss us out. That's the way this place works." A heavy silence settled between them, and Emma's thoughts spun in circles. She had known that their lives could never be easy, but this was different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fitting in, earning a place, proving that they were worthy of the safety they had been promised. She glanced over at James, who was playing with a small stone he had found near the fire. His face was calm, but his eyes were still wide with the weight of everything that had happened. Emma wanted to protect him from all of this, from the harsh realities of the world they were now a part of, but she didn't know how. They had already lost so much. How could they ever find peace? As the day wore on, the camp began to quiet. People went about their work in the dimming light, preparing for the night ahead. Jonah had left, disappearing into the shadows, and Emma couldn't help but feel the weight of his absence. Was he a friend, or was he just another figure in this world of uncertainty? Ethan seemed to share her concerns. He stood up, scanning the camp again, his eyes sharp as ever. "Stay close," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's figure out what we need to do to get by here. We don't know who we can trust." Emma nodded, her stomach knotting as she stood to follow him. She didn't know what they were going to do next. All she knew was that they had to keep moving forward. The alternative was worse. As they moved through the camp, Ethan and Emma kept their heads down, making their way toward a small group of people gathered near a fire. One of them, a woman with dark hair and a stern expression, looked up as they approached. She studied them for a moment before speaking. "You two are new," she said, her voice steady but not unfriendly. "We don't get many newcomers. What's your story?" Ethan glanced at Emma before replying. "Just looking for a place to rest," he said. "We're not looking for trouble." The woman seemed to assess him, then nodded. "You're in the right place for now," she said. "But remember what I said. Prove you're useful, and you'll stay. If not—" Her words trailed off, and the warning was clear. Ethan and Emma exchanged a glance before nodding in silent understanding. There were no guarantees here. They would have to fight for their place, just as they had fought for survival all along. As they sat by the fire, Emma's thoughts drifted back to the days before they had been taken from their home, before the world had turned upside down. She wondered if they would ever find a place to call home again. But for now, all she could do was hold on to the faint hope that they could carve out a life here. In this world of uncertainty, hope was a rare and fragile thing, but Emma refused to let go of it. Not yet. Not while they still had each other. "I know it's not easy, but this is the only way we survive." Jonah's voice was quieter now, but it carried a weight that made Emma's heart beat faster. The days had started to blur together, each one moving like the next, the exhaustion from the long journey taking its toll on them all. The settlement they had arrived in was not a refuge. It was another part of the world that simply survived, just like they did. It was a place where people kept their heads down, where trust was earned and not freely given. The harsh reality of this new life was beginning to sink in. The woman who had spoken to them earlier, the one who had warned them to prove themselves or leave, had disappeared into the shadows of the camp, leaving only the heavy silence behind. Now, Jonah was guiding them through the camp, his movements swift and calculated. "Keep up," he said, glancing back at Emma and James, who followed closely behind him. Emma could feel the weight of the eyes on them. People watching, waiting to see what they would do next. She wasn't sure if they were watching with curiosity or suspicion, but it didn't matter. They were still outsiders, still strangers in a place where everyone had their own hidden stories. The camp had a strange, almost oppressive energy to it. People lived in constant survival mode, constantly on alert. It was a world where kindness was rare, but everyone knew the value of loyalty and strength. Emma couldn't help but feel like they were on the edge of something dangerous, something unpredictable. Jonah led them to a small, makeshift structure near the edge of the camp. It wasn't much, just a few rough-hewn wooden walls and a tarpaulin roof, but it was shelter. It was better than the nothing they had left behind. "This is where you'll stay for now," Jonah said as he stopped in front of the entrance. He glanced around quickly before speaking again, his voice low. "Stay here, keep quiet, and don't draw attention to yourselves." Emma nodded, but the unease in her chest didn't go away. She glanced over at James, who had been silent for most of the day. His eyes were wide, still adjusting to the reality of this new life. She could see the fear in his face, the same fear she felt every time they entered a new place. The thought of staying here, of being surrounded by people who didn't care about them, made her stomach twist. But she didn't have a choice. They had nowhere else to go. Jonah moved aside to allow them to enter the small structure. Inside, it was cramped but relatively safe. There was enough space for them to sleep, and the walls, though crude, provided a sense of protection. Emma looked around, her eyes scanning the sparse interior. A small fire pit was set in the middle, the remnants of a recent fire still smoldering. The air inside was thick, the smell of smoke and damp earth hanging in the atmosphere. It felt cold, even though the temperature outside was warm. As they settled in, Jonah crouched near the fire pit, his eyes darting to the entrance. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low. "I need to check something. Stay here, don't go out." With that, he left, disappearing into the shadows outside. Emma and James sat in the corner of the room, the silence between them stretching out like an endless road. Emma's mind raced, but she didn't know what to think. She didn't know if they were safe here, if they would be safe anywhere. The weight of everything that had happened, their parents' disappearance, the constant running, the fear that had become a part of them, was pressing down on her chest. She looked over at James. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. James didn't answer immediately. He sat on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest, his small hands tightly gripping his sleeves. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with the same fear that had been in her heart for days. "What if we can't stay here?" he whispered. Emma swallowed, trying to keep the tears at bay. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know what would happen next. All she could do was hold on to him, hold on to the small glimmer of hope that somehow they would be all right. The door creaked open, and Jonah stepped back inside. He looked over at them, his eyes hard but with a hint of something else behind them, something Emma couldn't quite read. "We're not safe here," he said quietly. The words struck Emma like a blow to the chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. Jonah paused, looking around the small room before answering. "There are people here who don't want you here," he said. "People who won't hesitate to take what they want. You're not safe, not yet." The weight of his words crashed down on Emma, her chest tightening. She had known, deep down, that this place wouldn't be the answer. There was no place that was safe. Not for them, not for anyone. Jonah looked at her for a moment before speaking again, his voice low and serious. "We need to get out of here. But we can't leave without a plan. We can't leave without making sure you're both safe." Emma felt her heart race as she nodded. She didn't know where they would go or what would happen next, but for the first time in a while, she felt a spark of determination. They wouldn't be here long. They couldn't stay. But wherever they went next, they would face it together. She had to believe that. She had to believe that they could survive. And maybe, just maybe, they would find the safety they had been searching for all this time. She looked over at James, his tired face now soft with a hint of hope. They had made it this far. They would make it further. Together. "I told you it wouldn't be easy." Jonah's words echoed in Emma's mind as they prepared to leave the small shelter they had stayed in for the night. The camp was waking up slowly, the sound of murmurs and movement filling the air. People were going about their tasks, repairing tools, checking supplies, and getting ready for the day ahead. It was a quiet, calculated routine, as though each person knew exactly what was expected of them in this fragile world. Emma sat near the fire pit, her hands tightly clutching the small bundle of belongings they had managed to gather during their time in the settlement. She glanced over at James, who had been quiet all morning, his eyes distant. He hadn't said much since Jonah's warning the night before, and Emma couldn't help but wonder what was going through his young mind. After everything they had been through, after the constant fear and the unknowns of their journey, the weight of it all seemed to be pressing down harder on him than ever. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him it would be okay, but she wasn't sure herself. Jonah had made it clear that this wasn't their home, that they couldn't stay here any longer, and the reality of that was sinking in fast. She looked up at Jonah, who was standing at the edge of the camp, speaking in low tones with a few others. His face was serious, his eyes darting around the camp as though he was looking for something or someone. Emma couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something else at play here, something deeper. She didn't know what Jonah's plans were, but she could tell he was trying to keep something from them. And that scared her. She had trusted him, but now, with every passing hour, her doubt was growing. Jonah finally turned and walked over to them, his gaze steady but unreadable. "We need to move out now," he said, his voice low. "There are people here who will try to stop us. We can't waste any more time." Emma stood, looking at him closely. She didn't trust the urgency in his voice, but she didn't have a choice. They had to go. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jonah paused for a moment, his eyes hardening. "I'm taking you to a place that's safer. It's a long way, but it's the only way. And how do we know we can trust you?" Emma's words were sharper than she intended, but she couldn't hold back the frustration any longer. Jonah didn't flinch. "You don't," he said. "But you don't have many options, do you?" His words stung, but they were true. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she glanced over at James, who had now stood up, his face pale but determined. She could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else there, too. He trusted her, and that was all that mattered. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. Jonah nodded, leading the way toward the edge of the camp. As they moved through the settlement, Emma felt the weight of eyes on them, watching their every step. Some people glanced away quickly, while others didn't even try to hide their suspicion. The tension in the air was thick, but Emma didn't dare speak up. They couldn't afford to draw attention to themselves now. The path they took led them deeper into the wilderness, away from the camp and the small group of people who had accepted them for just a moment in time. The trees grew denser as they moved, the sounds of the settlement fading into the distance. The forest around them felt more alive than the camp had, the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds filling the air. It was strange, but Emma found herself appreciating the silence. It was the first time in days that she had felt truly alone, away from the judgmental eyes of the people who had briefly become part of their lives. As they walked, Jonah slowed his pace, allowing Emma and James to catch up. He glanced back at them, his eyes flicking between the two of them. "We're heading to a place called Hawks Ridge," he said. "It's about a day's walk from here. I know it sounds far, but we'll be safer there." "Why is it safer?" Emma asked, her curiosity piqued despite the lingering distrust. Jonah gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because no one knows we're going there. It's off the grid. The kind of place where people disappear." His words sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She had never been to such a place, and the thought of it made her uneasy. But she couldn't deny that they needed a place to rest, a place to get away from the ever-present danger. "And after that?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Jonah's gaze hardened, his expression serious. "After that, we figure out what's next. We stay quiet, keep our heads down, and survive." Emma nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at her. It felt like they were always one step away from danger, from being discovered. And it wasn't just the threat of being hunted by people who wanted to use them. It was the constant reminder that they were still running, still trying to find a place that could be home. But for now, they had to keep moving. They had no other choice. As they continued walking, the dense forest started to thin out, and Emma noticed the sky above, the faint traces of dusk beginning to settle in. The day was slipping away, but the journey was far from over. She glanced at Jonah, who was still leading the way, his expression unreadable. What was he keeping from them? What was really waiting at Hawks Ridge? For the first time in a long while, Emma felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. She didn't know the answers, but she did know one thing. They had to keep going. They had to trust that somehow they would survive this, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Together, they would make it. Somehow, they would make it. The journey had been long, but now, for the first time, Emma felt a weight lift from her chest. The forest around them was silent, the only sounds the distant rustling of leaves and their own footsteps on the soft earth. They had made it to Hawks Ridge. The place was everything Jonah had promised, a hidden refuge, a place forgotten by most, where they could finally catch their breath. The rugged cliffs surrounding the small valley were bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, casting long shadows over the camp. It was a quiet, serene place, and Emma couldn't help but wonder why such a peaceful spot had remained undiscovered for so long. Jonah led them deeper into the valley, his pace steady but not rushed. There were no eyes watching them here, no silent judgment or distrust, just the sound of the wind and the soft crunch of dirt underfoot. Emma couldn't help but breathe a little easier. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't running. They weren't looking over their shoulders. Jonah stopped near a small stone outcrop that overlooked the valley. It was the perfect place to see the entire camp below, but it also offered the solitude they desperately needed. "This is it," Jonah said, his voice quiet as he looked down at the camp. "This is as safe as you're going to get for now." Emma looked down at the small group of tents scattered below, the few people who lived here moving about, tending to fires, working with horses, or doing whatever needed to be done to survive. It was a strange peace that hung in the air, a kind of peace Emma had never known. She looked over at James, who was standing by her side, his expression a little less tense than it had been in the camp back at the settlement. He had been quieter than usual, and Emma could see the change in him. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "This is it, huh?" Emma whispered to Jonah, still unsure. "This is where we stay?" Jonah nodded, his eyes softening for a moment. "It's the best I can offer right now," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's better than running." Emma felt the uncertainty settle in her chest. Running. They had been running for so long, running from the memories of what had been left behind, from the fear of being caught. But here, now, in the shadow of the cliffs, it felt like they might finally have found a place to stop. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time in so long, she didn't feel like they were on the edge of something dangerous. They had made it. She had made it. But a part of her still hesitated. What if they were wrong? What if this peace was temporary, Just another illusion like all the others they had chased. Jonah seemed to read her thoughts. "You're not alone here," he said, his voice steady. "We take care of our own. No one will come for you here." But Emma wasn't sure how to trust that. She wasn't sure how to trust anything anymore. The world had taken so much from them. Her parents. Her life before all of this. The endless days of fear and running. But maybe this time, she could find a way to believe. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she turned to see Ethan approaching, his face set with determination. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but now, he looked almost relieved. He stopped beside her, his gaze taking in the camp below. "This is it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "This is where we make our stand." Emma looked up at him, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. They had no choice. They had to stay. They had to believe in this place, even if it felt like a dream that was just too good to be true. But the dream was all they had left. "We'll stay," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still clung to her. "We'll stay here." Ethan gave a small nod, his expression softening as he looked at her. He didn't say anything, but Emma could feel the weight of his approval. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They didn't need words. They just needed to survive. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the valley, Emma turned to look at James. He was standing close to her, his small hand slipping into hers as they stood together, staring out over the camp. She could feel the weight of his hand, warm and steady, a reminder that no matter what happened next, they had each other. They had made it this far. And maybe, just maybe, they had finally found a place where they could begin again. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt a spark of hope. They were not alone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like they might be safe. For now, that was enough.